Hello folks, and welcome to the next part of Project Ensis. And today it's a big one because we're making the motherboard tray. And in this build, it's not a regular motherboard tray. No, it's going to be a motherboard tray with a distro built in, along with also the cable management. Now I've done all of those things individually before, but this time we're dialing it to 11 because it's not just one layer or two, it's not even three. No, we're putting in 6 different layers. And this is going to be something really quite special. So the first layer is what you've just seen me cut, which is this 5mm aluminium piece. And this is nice and hefty because this is going to be supporting the motherboard itself. So if you may recall, the Z490 Waterforce Xtreme that we're using is incredibly hefty. I mean, it is a proper solid boy. So you want a nice and strong motherboard tray, and likewise this needs to be held perfectly in alignment with the panel that we made last week. So to that effect, this is where we're starting. And as you can see, it is not your standard shape. So actually it's going to be sitting like this. I actually posted up some screenshots of the CAD. So here's the CAD right now, and this is what we're going to be aiming for. So this piece here sits right on the front and has the threads, so the M3 threads, and then interfaces to the front of a distro plate. And now this distro plate will be adding more strength to this because obviously this is a bit sort of like a filament and it can flex a little bit. Despite it being quite stiff, I want it to be even stronger than this. So that's where the acrylic comes in. So the first layer of acrylic is going to be 10mm frosted, and that's going to be frosted on both sides. And then behind that, we're going to be putting a layer of 15mm. Now, why have I chosen 15mm? Well, there's a very specific reason indeed. So I want to have distro plate channels on the front of that, but I also want to have this sunk into the back, and then behind that, I'm going to have cabling milled into the block itself. So rather than sitting inside combs that kind of bolt onto it like I've done with AORUS and other projects such as the G-Skill Trident Z mod, this one I'm having them built into the water block itself, and we'll have integral combs instead. Now we'll be making the combs later on when we do the cabling, but for now we're going to be focusing on doing the aluminium work and the acrylic. And that should have some pretty cool stuff. And similar to the last panel, we're going to have some LEDs running along the side, so the whole thing should glow. And it should be pretty exciting because we've got LED covers, that's 2 layers. We've got this one over here, which is the front 5mm piece, and we have 3 layers of acrylic. And the final layer of acrylic is 8mm frosted again. So it should be pretty good. In fact, it might end up being 8mm clear. We'll see. That's going to be the last one to be done. We'll see how it kind of plays out. But either way, there's a lot of work to be done. And like with the back panel, I'm going to be taking this, I'm going to be glass blasting it so it has that lovely satin finish, because I think that really matches nicely not only with the RGB but with the components, specifically with the Z490 Waterforce Xtreme and the way that we've modded it, and also the 2080 Super block that we've got, which is the Waterforce Xtreme version, which has a lovely frosted finish to it. Now that's going to need some attention to that in a couple weeks time, so we'll consider what we need to do to that as well. But in the meantime, let's get this acrylic going because we've got this stuff over here to work with. So that's 10mm frosted. We're going to get to work on this first, and then we're going to turn our attention to the 15mm because that's going to be an interesting one. Every single one of these is a double-sided cut. So I'm going to have my wits about me and do things as well as I possibly can and be nice and precise. Not only that, there's only 0.15mm between the exterior of any of these aluminium parts and the acrylic here. So I'm going to have to make sure that I get my measurements spot on and all my 0 points exactly where they need to be, or else nothing is going to fit. Let's get to it. Alright, so we've got part 1 done, but I think before we get stuck into part 2, it's time to find out whether or not this is actually going to fit in, because this was quite a difficult milling job, and if it moved at all, then there's a good chance this will not line up. So let's give it a go. Okay, right, I'm quite happy with that. It's not moving whatsoever in any of these other directions. That is absolutely fantastic. So I left such a small offset between these two parts, so I was a bit worried that if it didn't come out just right, this wouldn't fit at all, and then I'd have to sort of go around filing it, because there was no hope that I can put this back on the machine and redo the sort of contours and things, because it would have just been too tight and it would have been an absolute nightmare trying to line it up. So thank goodness that fits. So that's pretty good. Now there's only one thing that I wasn't so happy with. Now this might not come across in the camera so well, but these finishes here on the particular pockets that this slots into, they're a little bit rough looking. So they don't feel rough, they feel smooth, but I can see them and I don't really like that. So I used the same sort of 5mm Datron polish cut end mill that I've used before. In fact, actually I used a new one. So they should have been particularly good. Now I've had this issue before. If you recall back to when I made those distro plate connectors for Acrylic, they had a sort of a matte finish to the channels there, and actually it's exactly the same finish on this. So I wonder if there's maybe a change in tool geometry responsible for that, because my settings are exactly the same. So I'm a little bit confused as to what's happened there, especially since some of the other end mills, certainly on this side, came out really smooth. So that's a little bit strange. I think before I get stuck into part 2, I'm just going to go over all the tool paths that maybe use the same tool and then swap them out for a different one which I know works 100%. But aside from that, I think that's pretty good. And of course most of this is covered up by the aluminium anyway, so it's not going to be a problem. And of course because this is frosted, you won't be able to tell anyway. But had this been clear, that wouldn't have been so great. Now for the second part, we've got some serious work to do. Because check this slab. This is 15mm acrylic, so it's quite a bit bigger. Now the thing is though, 15mm is where things start to get a little bit nuts with the tolerances. So whereas the 10mm is pretty on spec, this can vary an awful lot. And this one comes up to about 15.7mm, and in other parts 14.8, so it's almost a millimetre thicker in some parts than others. That's obviously no good because we've got O-rings, and if we want to have a good seal, it needs to be flat. So what we're going to be doing is basically taking this, putting it on the machine, and then facing it first, and then we're going to be doing all the main milling ops, and then after doing all that, we need to flip it over again, much like we did with this one, and do some pretty hefty cuts on the backside. So there's an awful lot of work to do on this one. This is the complex one, and it's also going to have all the threading, so there's an awful lot that can go wrong. So fingers crossed, let's get it on the machine and hope for the best. Now it's pretty late and I am absolutely shattered, but I think you'll agree that this has been worth all of the effort because it looks absolutely fantastic. I'm so pleased that everything lined up and slotted in, because that was definitely going to be one of the trickiest parts of this plate design. But everything sort of came together and now it really does look rather good, because this sort of ensemble, you can't really get a proper feel for it in CAD. You don't get an idea as to how the materials are going to play with one another and also how the lighting is going to play out. Now you can of course try rendering it, but even that's pretty difficult, because even if you use very accurate materials, it doesn't necessarily mean it's actually going to look that way, because there's all sorts of things going on under the hood that can change the way things work out, even just down to the details of which LED strips you use. Speaking of which, now I didn't actually mention in the last video which ones I was using. So these are AlphaCool Aurora flexible ones. So they have some rigid and a flexible, and I'm using the flexible ones here to be able to go around this contour. And the best bit about them is the fact that they're incredibly thin. So as I mentioned, I only need to make like a 3mm channel in this, so 3mm wide and 6mm deep, which means that I can put them in much more sort of tricky to access areas than I normally would have been able to with some of the larger strips. And this is fantastic because there isn't actually a whole lot of space inside this giant plate. Now, unfortunately, the LED kind of effect isn't quite as strong as the back panel, but that's just because this is very, very wide, it's very chunky, there's a lot of plastic for the lights to diffuse through. But I think when it's combined with the back panel, which will be sitting over here, along with all the other accent pieces, there's going to be another big reservoir which goes down this side, it's going to be absolutely fine. There's going to be so much light in here that it's not going to matter at all. Now, to get these lovely gradients, this is one of the best features. I love being able to get these lovely smooth gradients. I'm using the Phanteks RGB controller for this, and it's absolutely brilliant if you like those sort of turquoises, the kind of interesting pastel colors that you don't usually get with most preset gradients. So I thoroughly recommend that, and it's what I'm using for this one over here. But in terms of how this is all gone and then where we're going to be going from now, well, with this done, it's time to focus on some of the individual parts of the structure itself. So now we've got the motherboard tray, we can obviously fit the motherboard to that, which will then fit to the back panel. But of course, I then need to focus on the water cooling. So what are we going to do about that? So next on the list is actually a backplate for the 2080 Super Extreme Waterforce that's going into this build. I could obviously just paint or strip back the existing backplate, but I'm not really a huge fan of how it will look because it's got lots of sort of ventilation holes and everything. So I'd rather try making one, which is interesting because that's an experimental idea. So I want to try making one that will match up with the rest of the build, and also experiment with a few ideas that I'd like to do in some of the latter parts, so it makes sense to try and get those things done ASAP. And then after the backplate, we're also going to be taking a look at the main reservoir. So it's going to be a big angular sort of reservoir going on this side here, and that's going to have a pump built into the bottom. So I've got a D5 pump for that. So that should be pretty exciting. So those are the next major steps. And then after that, it's going to be taking a look at the bottom structure, the radiator mounts, cabling, all of that kind of stuff. Now, speaking of cabling, this is going to be really interesting, because I haven't done this in a very long time. So what I've done here is I've actually milled out pockets for all the cabling. So if you know I usually do cable combs around the back, well, instead of putting them on like kind of sticking out of the surface, I thought I'd build them in. Now obviously this idea has been done before. I've done it myself actually 4 years ago, but I haven't really revisited because it's an awful lot of work and you had to have so many extra steps. But I think it's worth it for a proper kind of crazy project, isn't it? So that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to be training the cables all the way from the side around the top in through here, and this is going to be where the power supply is going to be sitting. So that should be really rather special. And I'd like to hear in the comments which combination of sleeving colours you think I should have a look at, because I'm a little bit undecided. This is a very neutral looking build, so I've got a lot of choices. Now I'm leaning towards the sort of silver, purple, blues like we've got in here at the moment, but maybe that could change. We could maybe experiment maybe things like oranges for Gigabyte and AORUS, for instance, or maybe we could look at some other combinations. Maybe a deep blue would be really interesting. So I'd like to know what you guys think. Now it goes without saying that the best way to stay up to date with builds like this one, and of course all the other content on the channel, is to subscribe if you haven't already. And also you can find us over on Facebook, Instagram, builds.gg and Twitter. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, don't forget to pop by our merchandise store linked below and check out, see if there's anything that strikes your fancy. Take care folks, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.